Hello, hello. Welcome back. Welcome to another episode of the Mini Albums podcast by Zigenthaler. I am your host, Lilith, and I am also the creator behind the mini album series that you may have seen online. I've had a couple of weeks off. Sort of needed it, but guess what? I'm back and I'm better than ever. And I'm so excited to present you guys with this episode. I've got so much stuff I want to talk about. First thing I just want to point out is that if you are watching this on YouTube, so if you are watching the video podcast, yes, I do have a sock over my microphone. I'm having a little bit of difficulty trying to manage the plosives in my speech, and when I do go back on the recordings, they are just ruining like the lower end of the audio. So this is sort of a DIY pop filter, so don't mind that. I know it looks really weird. I tried to make it look nice. I chose specifically a white sock that would go with my white microphone. I probably do need to upgrade, but that is gonna happen in the future because I haven't had time. So that is why there is a sock over my microphone. Okay, so in this episode today, first, I'd like to say that I'm going to introduce a new segment, and that's going to go at the beginning of the podcast, and it's basically just going to be, I just want to discuss music news, and that is inspired by the fact that I really just want to lightly touch on what has been happening between Universal Music and TikTok, especially this month. So we're going to briefly talk about that, and I did ask for your guys' opinions on my Instagram as well, so we're going to be diving into that. So that's going to be like the introduction, the sort of ease into the podcast now. I'm going to try and pick a small music news piece that we can sort of talk about. Then we're going to be going into the album. So I'll talk to you about Igor by Tyler, the Creator. Really excited to get into that. Then we're going to be looking into what you guys had to say about the album. And again, I did post that on my Instagram stories, so make sure to follow me on Instagram if you want to be involved in the future. After that, I usually talk about a topic related to the album, or loosely related. And today, I really want to talk about pigeonholing artists and the consequences that can come from that. Tyler, the Creator, is a really good example of a very multifaceted artist. Especially with his album, Igor, I feel like he really sort of broke away from what he was usually known for, but really sort of broadened his horizons with Igor. But I want to talk about how we have a tendency to pigeonhole artists creatively, and I think there's consequences that come with that. I also want to look into it on a racial level as well, because Igor did get nominated for a Grammy in the 2020 Grammys. It got nominated and won in the section of Best Rap Album of the Year. And of course, like many musicians, Tyler was obviously very grateful for this award, but also commented that it was sort of a backhanded compliment because Igor got categorized in rap. And I think that really sort of opens up a conversation about artists that are people of color that sort of get pigeonholed into specific genres. And especially since in this month we actually had the Grammys, the 2024 Grammys, I think there is a bigger conversation to have about even specifically this institution and how people of color are sort of pigeonholed as well as artists in specific racial categories. So yeah, that's what you can expect from today's podcast. Really hope you enjoy it, and we're just gonna kick on. We're gonna kick on straight into it. Okay. First thing I want to talk about is what the hell is going on between Universal Music and TikTok. Just in case you don't know, I'm a very chronically online person, so I've been following this a lot. But basically what happened is that Universal Music and TikTok had an agreement in that TikTok could use the Universal Music catalog. And of course, that is a big part of the content that TikTok creates. People are dancing, people are lip syncing, people are doing remixes and all that jazz. That contract had the duration of about 3 years and was set to renew on the 1st of February in 2024. Now, the contract didn't get renewed. They couldn't come to terms or an agreement with anything. And obviously, since 2020, TikTok has become one of the biggest social media platforms in the world. And Universal Music basically pulled their entire catalog because they couldn't reach an agreement. And I just feel like I've been the only one that's been acting like this is like a big media music apocalypse. Because essentially you've got two big dogs of two different industries. You've got Universal Music, someone that takes up a massive, massive sector of the music industry. And then you've got TikTok, which is also arguably one of the most biggest social media platforms today. It has created the bedrock of Gen Z culture. It has revolutionized social media and the way that we consume media, and that is obviously through short form content. So TikTok is a big player in the game as well, and these two big dogs are not getting along. And I just think it's interesting because I myself am pretty much caught in the rift of these two industries because I do create content on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, and my content is very music centric. So when things like entire catalogs get pulled, it's sort of just like, okay, like this is gonna change both industries. I think it's gonna change TikTok because it is so heavily reliant on music. And I think that maybe this is gonna shift. TikTok content is going to shift more, maybe even sort of like YouTube, in that it's going to look into more long form, more original content. And then when you look at Universal Music, it's just like, okay, like how is this going to affect this label? And the thing is that when it came to listening and discovering music, like say 20 years ago, you know, people would listen to the radio and that's how you would discover songs and pop music and, you know, the mainstream music that was being pumped out of the industry. Now, people don't listen to the radio. And I was thinking about, like, how do people find and listen to music? And it's through social media. And, like, especially in the last couple of years, it's through TikTok, you know, and it's not just new songs, it's also old songs that go through the TikTok algorithm and trend. There are so many artists that have, like, created followings on TikTok that have then gone on to be signed by Universal Music or signed by a big record label. So social media plays a massive, massive role in the way that we discover and listen to music. And to have the biggest record label pull its entire catalog off of one of the social media platforms that is also quite big is crazy. Maybe it's going to be a step in the direction of Universal becoming more of a legacy label, in that they have a lot of big artists that don't necessarily need TikTok to promote their work because they already have an established listener base. Taylor Swift is an example. So I don't know whether Universal Music is probably shifting its focus more towards these artists that already have big followings, and new music will only be created through artists that have a established listener base, rather than trying to scout and create talent and to sort of nurture a new generation of artists, because you need engines like TikTok to sort of help propel that type of music. But this is the thing, Universal Catalog is still available on Instagram and YouTube, so I can still post my videos on those two platforms. And I don't know if that's because of this whole situation where everyone is villainizing TikTok because it is not part of that whole Mark Zuckerberg, Instagram, Facebook family. And I put a poll on my Instagram story and I asked you guys what you thought about who is going to basically come out of this situation better. So I asked who is losing the most right now out of this like whole fallout in regards to the agreement. 48% of you said Universal, and then 52% of you said TikTok. And I did ask you guys what you thought about the whole situation, if you had any comments, and I just want to read through a couple of interesting ones I got in. One person says, considering how often a song that goes viral on TikTok will end up charting and performing extremely well, I think Universal will be hurt more in the long run. The reduced exposure of their artists' newest releases, as well as the reduced ability to make old releases pop off again, is a big negative for every single one of the Universal artists. And I completely agree. As I said before, it's not just new music, it's also old music. Like, the amount of just like small like guitar riffs or just like tiny little snippets of old music that's just like been thrown into the TikTok rhythm and just like exploded the song again. Another point that someone actually brought up was if Universal wanted their artists to earn more money, they would just pay them more, which I also would agree. One of the things that Universal said, I think they did an open letter to TikTok, and one of the reasons they said that they weren't continuing with the agreement is that because the artists need to be compensated more. And I just think that's really interesting. One, coming from one of the biggest labels in the world, and two, coming from a label that is putting their entire catalogue on streaming programs who are notorious for also underpaying their artists as well. Like, the amount of streams that you need to make a living off of like your music is insane. So yeah, that's an interesting point to bring up as well. Someone else said, it feels like a race to the bottom for generating money from music, and TikTok sped it up. And then another person says, I don't think Universal would make such a big move without a reason, but it definitely isn't fair for creators. And there are creators on TikTok that became famous on TikTok that then got signed on to Universal Music. But yeah, that's just the interesting news piece I wanted to talk about today. Okay, so we're going to be going into Igor now by Tyler, the Creator. First, I'm just going to go into some basic album info. So, Igor is the 5th studio album by artist Tyler, the Creator. It was released in May of 2019 through Columbia Records, which is owned by Sony Entertainment. In regards to ranking and reception, Igor was Tyler's first #1 US charting album. On the Billboard 200, it replaced Confessions of a Dangerous Mind by Logic as #1, and then would go on to be replaced by When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go by Billie Eilish a week later. It was also nominated and won a Grammy for the Best Rap Album in the 2020 Grammys, and we will get onto that later on. In regards to the lineup, Tyler, the Creator, is credited as the sole producer and arranger, and obviously he performed on the album as well. And there are also some notable credited contributors and performers such as Lil Uzi Vert, Solange, Kanye West, Playboi Carti, Pharrell, Laro, and more. In regards to the album artwork, the main album, which you might know, which is the pink background with the picture of Tyler, that album cover was directed by Luis Perez, but there's also a special edition vinyl cover, which is basically like an abstract artwork sketch of Tyler, and that is by the artist Louis Rossignol, with contributions from Tyler himself as well. So yeah, that's the album that we're looking into. And I will not lie. The first time I listened to this album in 2019, like I was a little bit shocked because I was like, oh, this is so like disjointed and weird. And it's funny coming onto this podcast and having also listened to albums like Demon Days, because I think that these two albums are very similar. Igor is a concept album. I feel like it does more as an album in itself and sort of this trajectory that you go through in regards to like the story and the sound. I feel like that is a little bit more meaningful than like just the songs as individual releases. Tyler sort of creates this patchwork of like soul, R&B, pop, and rap, and he really sort of helps it to tell this story of love throughout the whole album, and sort of brings it all together with this character called Igor. We're going to be looking into that character later and how that sort of is a symbol of the underbelly of love. Don't worry, the explanation isn't going to be as corny as that sounds, but I think that that's a really good way to sort of showcase love, you know, and showcase the fact that maybe you aren't always a victor in love. Sort of what I want to first get into is basically like this story that Igor is going through. And the crazy thing is that when I took a week off of this podcast, I sort of went through this whole trajectory of emotions. And it's basically like the sort of evolutions of these feelings when you are in love with someone or when you're infatuated with someone. And it's not just like the beautiful, funny, like, oh, like electrifying, lovey-dovey feelings, you know. I think there are specific chapters in Igor that Tyler really brings the listener through that just shows the evolution of those feelings. It can be like very quite relatable, especially when you have it in your own life, which is what happened with me. I went through this like week of just like you get happy and you're really excited about like this prospect of someone, and then, you know, down the track you see those feelings sort of turn more into like desperation and sort of like devotion, and then like a little bit of jealousy, and then, you know, you're almost questioning yourself, and then you sort of like get over this hill of like the peak of those emotions, and then you've got like this bittersweetness and this acceptance, which is basically what I feel like Igor is. And I'm going to be going through like those chapters. So the beginning of the album is like the first chapter, and I've called this the honeymoon chapter. And that includes Igor's theme, Earthquake, and I Think. This is like the happy, the fun, the exciting, the sort of electrifying feeling of knowing that you're in love with someone or you have a crush on someone. It's so addictive. It's like a massive dopamine release. And I think that's essentially what that first part of the album is. I mean, Igor's theme is a little bit more of like an introduction to the album. It's sort of easing us into this story. It's very much like the intro to Demon Days, where it's like this is what the album is. But then you've got Earthquake, which I think it's sort of the more happier and pop tunes of the album. You know, You Make My Earthquake. And then you have I Think as well, which is a very, you know, it's not fast paced, but it's got a beat. It's still like very much a major sounding song. I Think I'm Falling in Love. This time I think it's for real. Like, these lyrics really sort of showcase, again, that exciting feeling. And that's what I would call the honeymoon chapter of this album. Then the next chapter, which is the next 5 songs. And those songs are Exactly What You Run From, You End Up Chasing, Running Out of Time, New Magic Wand, A Boy Is a Gun, and Puppet. And I called this the transformation chapter. We've left this sort of honeymoon phase, like this exciting feeling of love. And now we're starting to see these sort of like emotions over time. They're transforming a little bit, and they're sort of turning, not ugly, but you sort of see like this underside of like wanting someone or having a crush on someone. And we go through those individual emotions with each song. For instance, I mean, I'm not going to say Exactly What You Run From is What You End Up Chasing. That I feel like is just like that's sort of like a little interlude and a little sort of like thought bubble. But in regards to the songs, Running Out of Time, that's very much the desperation through time, that sort of impatience that you get. And I very much empathize with that when it's just like, you know, there's that person and you just want to be with them. You just want to, where are they? Like, I'm running out of time. I want to, you know, it's sort of that desperation of action. New Magic Wand is very much, you know, when you find out that there's someone else in the equation. And I think that song really projects that feeling of jealousy, that feeling of envy, you know, when you find out that it's not just you two, there might be someone else, and that's always a very triggering feeling. You've got A Boy Is a Gun. That song is very much realizing how much power the other person has and how much power you're essentially giving to them, and that you essentially accept that you don't really have control over that. There's almost this vulnerability of like, you're on the line, but essentially it's not really your choice. You're not the one that has, you know, your finger on the trigger of a gun, say, that's pointing exactly at you. And then Puppet as well, I feel like is a song that's meandering in those feelings of just sort of like this blind devotion. And it's super frustrating, you know, knowing that despite, say, in the second chapter of all of these feelings that you're going through, like jealousy and impatience and like desperation and like suspicion and everything, and despite that, you're still so blindly devoted. Again, I feel like it's almost helplessness as well, because I mean, half of the time when we do like people, half of it is literally just like body chemistry. It's like pheromones, it's body chemistry. Sometimes I feel like a lot of us are like, why is this happening to me? This sucks. So that's the transformation chapter. And then we basically go to the climax of the album, and that's just one song, and that is What's Good. And I feel like this is the pinnacle of the album, where we sort of see this trajectory sort of like peak, in that I think that Tyler really creates this feeling of a revelation. And I've looked online a little bit about how people have interpreted this song, and a lot of people were talking about how it's like, oh, you know, it's about like breaking away from society norms and like a revelation through that. I interpreted it as like a revelation through like this whole process where you're being pushed to that point. You know, you almost feel deranged in the moment, because it's just like you've got all of these emotions going on about this person, which have literally just derived from liking them or having a crush on them or loving them. And he sort of comes to terms with what is happening. There is like this perfect outro of this song where it's like he's just singing, I see the light. I see the light. And there's this beautiful, beautiful sort of gentle piano playing in the background. And to me, that just perfectly shows like that moment. The clouds from your mind just sort of like disappear. All of this, like, I guess, turmoil and everything, all of these feelings have just sort of, that have been clouding your mind, just sort of disappear. And you just sort of realize, I see the light. I realize that maybe something isn't going to happen. I realize that this maybe is a losing battle. I realize that maybe this isn't going to go in my way. Maybe I need to accept my losses, or maybe I need to accept what's inevitable. And maybe that is that this person that I like is never going to like me back. And that's like the climactic part. So I call that the climax chapter. And then you've got sort of the bittersweet ending chapter of the album. And that's with the songs Gone, Gone, /Thank You. You've got I Don't Love You Anymore and Are We Still Friends? And I guess those songs in themselves are pretty self-explanatory. Like, I think this is like that bittersweet chapter where it's like, okay, we've gotten over that hill. We've come to the point where we're accepting what's happening. Feelings are sort of melting away. And then sort of that bittersweetness at the end where it's just sort of like, where is this going to go? Is this going to impact us on a friendship level? Us just as humans? How are we going to relate to each other in the future? And it's like that falling down and then that realizing, it's like that hitting the earth after you've been up here, you know, you're all happy, and then you've just hit the ground and you're just sort of like sitting in that, healing through it, and it's just, that part always sucks so much. That is basically what I see as like the trajectory of emotions that one feels. And I'm going to describe it as unrequited love, because I mean, at the end, we don't really get that happy ending. We don't really get what we wanted. And I really think that Tyler also, as an arranger and a producer of this album, he really is able to showcase this story through his production and the composition of the songs. Because you've got a bit of variance, I feel, with a lot of the chapters, especially when you compare like the first 3 songs to the middle part of the album to like the end of the album. I feel like it really all sort of comes together. And in general, the whole composition and production of this album is obviously, it's a little bit more different to what Tyler usually creates. And I sort of see like 2 major influences when it comes to the main sound of this album. One of the influence is that I feel like Tyler really took inspiration from this old school, like nostalgic love song sound. And like, I'm talking about this smooth, soulful love song era. Like, I'm thinking Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole. When I listen to the album, my mind always goes to like Tonight You Belong to Me by Patience and Prudence. It's sort of this like boppy, old school love song, like sound aesthetic. And you can hear it throughout the album. So he's constantly got like these backing vocals in a lot of his compositions, and they're very chorus-like, and they're very young and boppy, and they're mixed in this high register, which I think imitates sort of the old recording techniques of these microphones that almost sound like a telephone, you know, like the bottom end of the recording is non-existent. It's all very like high. And I feel like you can hear that in a lot of the performances throughout the album. It's that high register. Even Tyler performs, I feel like he also has his vocals mixed in that particular way. There's also like this graininess, almost like static in the background of some songs, like it was recorded in an old school way. Like you can hear this fuzzy static in the background of Igor's theme, and I think, you know, there are lots of other different influences, like, you know, you've got the piano, you've got like the organ, you've got some strings coming in. Like, I feel like it's very much revolving around, as I said, this nostalgic love song aesthetic. But I think Tyler really balances that out a lot with his own influence. He uses synths, he's got lots of samples, he's obviously rapping a lot, and I feel like he just brings these 2 styles together and creates a really unique sound within the album. And then I think he also really uses them to escalate the story within the album. You've got like that first chapter, like the honeymoon chapter, where it's just like influences of soul and R&B, but you know, they're very happy, they're very major, they're very boppy. And then I feel like we see a little bit more of a variance when we go into the second chapter. So when we're looking at Running Out of Time, New Magic Wand, you know, he introduces a lot more synths, the bass comes in a lot more. The songs are a little bit more minor sounding. They're a little bit more ominous. There are like specific parts in the songs where everything sort of breaks down and it's just Tyler commentating something. Or on the other hand, we have like songs that are very dense. And when I say that, I mean like when I listen to A Boy Is a Gun, I don't know how many times I listen to this song, but like each time I'm just like trying to keep track of how many different stems, so like how many different layers are in the composition. I feel like I can pick out 4 to 5 different vocal lines. So you've got like 2 sets of backing vocals in this song, and each set has maybe 2 or 3 harmony lines. Then you've got a rap line on top of that. You've got a vocal tape loop, sometimes even 2. You've got a bass, and then you've got the rhythm section. You also have piano. You've got piano chords, and then you've got like this sort of ad-lib solo high register piano embellishment part that's sort of like coming in and out. And then you've got like this synth that sounds like it just came out of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles. This recording is so dense. And like every time I listen to it, I'm just like, the amount of respect that I have for Tyler being able to like mix, arrange and produce this track is just insane to me, because like working with, you know, that many vocal lines and that many like different elements all coming together, and then he also like uses the sound effect of a gun to signify a new phrase within the song, and it all fits in and it's all in time with each other. Like, it's just crazy. And then when we get to the third chapter, I feel like the music is a little bit more dissonant in What's Good, probably one of the heavier, more minor songs of the album. And then chapter 4, I think, is executed so perfectly, because it's like we've basically come full circle and come back to this sort of lovey-dovey feeling, only musically, like from the beginning of the album. So it's like it's less about the rap and it's more about like, you know, the chords a little bit more sustained, the tempos are a little bit slower, there's less of that happiness and that spark, and it's sort of sitting with that bittersweetness. And I think that is shown really well through that chapter. And even just ending on something like Are We Still Friends? Like it sounds like an old school finale song that they'd be singing at the end of like, you know, some old school movie. He's got this organ in the song, and then there, you know, there are these really sort of screechy strings. Like, I think it's like the perfect end to an album. I think that there is an art in top and tailing an album really well. And I think with Igor as well, it's sort of like, yeah, you come full circle, but it's like, it's that love, that feeling of love at the beginning of the album, but it's just turned a little bit sour. And yeah, it's bittersweet. And I just want to talk specifically about this concept of Igor, because I feel like Tyler creates these characters and they really sort of help push whatever creative expression he wants to do. And I think that Igor is such a great symbol of the underbelly of love. Because when you think of Igor, and like, this is me just conspiring, this is just a theory of mine, but like when you think of the name Igor, this isn't a common name. I'm feeling like he is trying to relate it to, you know, the stock character Igor, which is essentially always just this weird, ugly character. They're basically like a side piece to a more grandiose character, like, you know, a supervillain or, you know, a mad scientist. Igor is just sort of there for the plot. And I feel like Igor is very much a character that gets overlooked. You know, he's there, he's doing all the work, but he's never really seen as anything more than that. And I feel like relating that to the story that you sort of see through the album, it really, shows that pinnacle of maybe we never really get what we want out of, you know, our own love pursuit. And it really shows how we can sort of feel like we're left in the shadows. You know, we're not the grand scientists. We're not the grand creation the scientists created. We were just like that smaller character in the shadows. And maybe it wasn't about getting what we wanted, it was just about being a part of the story or the plot. I think that this is a much more interesting side to love, because I feel like there's a lot of us that don't really become victors in our pursuits. So yeah, that's what I have to say about Igor by Tyler, the Creator, and what I have to say about that album. Now we're going to be looking into what you guys had to say. I didn't get as many replies on this album, and that's fine, but I love to hear what you guys have to say, especially when you've got weird stories about like, oh, I remember listening to this album when I was high or anything like that. So, okay. One person says, one of my favorite albums of all time. It's a musical loop signifying the character's cycle. Someone says, one of his best albums besides Cherry Bomb. Someone says, one of the best albums ever. We've got another comment here that says, not a rap fan, but even I can say it's a really good album. Someone says, amazing, in all caps. Oh, someone else says, not a fan, but still a good album nonetheless. Someone says, one of my favorite albums of all time. Someone else says, absolutely unseen in today's rap scene, a masterpiece. Someone says, amazing coming out album. So I didn't actually know, or I didn't think that this was like Tyler's coming out. I thought that there was like already some skepticism a couple albums before, and I thought that there were like some sort of tweets that came out. I feel like it's just been like a sort of ongoing timeline of him coming out. Someone says it's perfect. Another person says a decent to strong 9. And then we've got this really in-depth reply from someone. Phenomenal album that showcases Tyler the Creator's creativity and vulnerability at its highest peak. Every time I listen to Igor, it takes me back to the summer of 2019. It scratches a very specific itch in my brain with its unparalleled sound. The lyrics, although not profound or poetic, still does a wonderful job displaying the emotions and heartbreak of a breakup album. The punchy beats, heartfelt screams, and ethereal harmonies and vocals from multiple artists take the album to another level. So yeah, that's what you guys had to say about the album. Thank you so much for your replies, and make sure to follow Zigenthaler if you want to contribute to any future episodes. Okay, and now we're getting into the part of the episode that I am most excited to talk about. And that is pigeonholing artists and the consequences that may come from that. I feel like Tyler the Creator is very much embodies this artist that is very multifaceted. You know, he is a rapper, performer. He's now extending into arrangement and composition and production. He also has like a foot in the fashion field. He's very musically expressive. He's also visually expressive, and that's a lot with his fashion, these characters that he creates. I feel like he's just a very all-rounded creative person. I like that because I feel like I'm very much the same. You know, it's not just about the music, it's about the sound, it's about the design, it's about the colors, it's about the fashion, it's about the performance. Like for me, that's what creates such complex and layered art. I wanted to talk about pigeonholing artists in a creative way because I feel like when Igor did get released, it was a little bit of a jump from what Tyler was known for. And I know that a lot of people say that he's a really good MC, he's a really good rapper, and he's got this amazing range of his voice. Like it is so deep. It really sort of sets him apart, I think, vocally from a lot of other performers. But, you know, he released Igor, which I watched an Apple Music interview, and he was saying how Igor was supposed to really open a lot of doors for him, and especially on the album cover it says completely arranged and produced or composed, I forget, or maybe all three, and that was to basically open doors for him for the future in case, you know, someone wanted him to do a score for a movie, or, you know, they wanted him to arrange something that may not just be about music, I don't know, like a story or something. And I don't know if it's just a byproduct of humans just needing to always have to fit something in a box and categorize it, but I feel like a lot of fans are embracing of that, but I feel like also a lot of people aren't. We're almost cutting ourselves off from having really amazing multi-layered art. I really think that we are doing ourselves and artists a disservice when we feel like we need to categorize them or tell them that they need to be playing to their strengths. And of course, when you're in the music industry, like, you need to make money to sustain yourself. We all need money because we live in a world where all of our resources are hidden behind paywalls. I'm not going to get into that. But, you know, at the end of the day, when you are an artist, you do need to be paid. And then, I think there's always this argument of, playing to your own strengths versus going out and evolving and pushing your creative boundaries. And doing that isn't necessarily met with an open embrace, and that might come from an artist's listener base. It might come from, the industry maybe the artist is trying to push into. I'm very much for the fact that, the creation of art is just basically the manipulation of senses and making someone feel a certain way through that manipulation. And the fact that we're like, oh, musician is like the manipulation of sound, visual artist is the manipulation of the eyes, and the fact that we even just sort of like categorize those as two different disciplines and that there isn't more sort of overlap. And it's just like, why would you not harness someone that could do both of those things and create something that could actually push the boundaries of what we know? And that's why I like Demon Days by the Gorillaz. I feel like that's that marriage of art and music. Another example I can think of is someone like David Bowie, who actually he wanted to do music, and I think he actually recorded a couple of singles with like bands and for himself, but they were never really successful. And his career really started to pick up when he really sort of started to embrace not just like his craft as a musician, but also as someone that also studied design and art. And then that all came together and created Ziggy Stardust. He is now known for being like one of the most influential musical artists, but also in the world of fashion. And the fact that he, harnessed this androgynous style, which was ahead of its time. Like, I feel like David Bowie is one of those artists that sort of like he really crossed a lot of fields and sort of meshed them all together. And I feel like that's what made him so groundbreaking. And like, I can even relate this all to myself. I feel like being creative doesn't mean that you need to fit yourself or pigeonhole yourself into like a specific industry. Like, I mean, I studied music, but I also really like visual art. And one of the biggest battles for me up to this point has always been like, oh, I have to choose one of them. I can't do both. Now I've sort of like shed that and been like, well, maybe I can be both of them. Maybe I can somehow fuse them together. Maybe I don't have to be in a specific category. And I feel like we should be giving artists, music artists, performers, visual artists, I think we should be giving them also like this freedom to be able to create multi-layered art. And I feel like that's just going to be so enriching, not just for them, but for their audience, for the world. So yeah, that's what I have to say about pigeonholing artists on a creative level. But a very other important realm we have to dive into is also on a racial level. So as I explained before, this has a lot to do with the fact that Igor was nominated for Best Rap Album and won in the 2020 Grammys. Tyler was obviously very grateful for having won an Academy Award, but he did comment that it was a bit of a backhanded compliment being put in that category. And he was basically pointing out that being put in these types of categories in the Grammys is essentially just a political correct way to call him the N-word. And I'm going to focus on the Grammys because we just had them in February, and I think it's a good example because the Grammys are an institution where, it's very much an honor for a music artist or a recording artist to win a Grammy. It's seen as a very prestigious thing to have received. But the Grammys also have like a massive history of systemic racism. And I actually went into a bit of research about it. It's interesting and it's really disheartening. So basically what happens is there is this notion that Black artists or artists of color are more likely to be nominated and win in categories where the genres are associated with their race. So specifically, it would be like urban, hip hop, R&B, and then they would be placed into these categories more than they would be placed into something like pop. And then basically the big four categories of the Grammys, so Album of the Year, Record of the Year, Song of the Year, and Best New Artist, are predominantly reserved for white artists and white artists winning those categories. And there is a history of snubs within the Grammys. since the Grammys were sort of created, which was in 1957, so that was 67 years ago, only 11 black artists have won Album of the Year. I know what a lot of people might say. They might come to the defense of this decision and be like, well, then maybe, like, you know, maybe black artists just didn't make good music. And like, that's just such a crazy assumption to make, especially when you look at like the American music landscape and how much black artists and artists of color have essentially shaped the genres that are very dominant within the music industry today, but still not being recognized for that. And it's happened all throughout history. You know, it's happened with, you know, and I will admit, like, I always thought that Elvis Presley was like the king of rock and roll. I thought he was the one that discovered it until, you know, later on in life when I discovered that, you know, there were black artists that were creating rock and roll, and like it essentially started with them. But Elvis Presley was that point where, you know, white people essentially took it. They put a white person as the forefront of that image, and then it just exploded and it became massive with white people. And it's not just rock and roll, it's with jazz. You could say it's also happened to a certain extent with hip hop. And yeah, it's just crazy the amount of influence these genres have had over music. And I'm specifically talking just about American music at the moment because the Grammys is an American institution. And yeah, 67 years and only 11 black artists have won Album of the Year. Like, that's insane. That's like 1/6. That's insane. While I was doing research about this, I was reading a very interesting article by Ann Powers, which was published on npr.org, and it's called "The Problem with the Grammys is Not a Problem We Can Fix." And it's basically talking about how rampant systemic racism is in the music industry. And so a particular section that really resonated with me was this. Throughout popular music, it also takes the form of pervasive ideas. These include the notion that music made with real instruments and sung straightforwardly, like Adele's Softly Tingled Soul or Sturgill Simpson's Racious Country, require more skill and vision than those created within the synth and sample-driven vernacular of hip-hop. The assumption that artists who stand still and sing, like Adele, are more authentic than those who dance, like Beyoncé, although dance and music have been inseparable at least since the jazz age, and the elevation of the self-contained singer-songwriter, a figure who's almost always white, over those who work more collaboratively. These ideas obscure the fact that most white performers who embody them borrow heavily from black musical traditions. Oh my god, and like this section just blew my mind. So when we talk about the Grammys and the fact that like they have snubbed a lot of black artists, and obviously that section is explaining that, I just want to give you some history as to like the types of snubs that have happened. So in 1984, Police's Every Breath You Take won over 2 of Michael Jackson's nominations, and that was for Song of the Year. And the 2 other nominations were Beat It and Billie Jean. And like, that is crazy to me. Every Breath You Take is obviously an amazing song. I'm not discrediting Police in any single way. But like, Billie Jean? It was over Billie Jean? Like, that's just insane to me. A couple of other snubs are in 2013, Mumford & Sons' Babel won over Frank Ocean's Orange in Album of the Year. Another one in 2016, we've got Taylor Swift's 1989 over Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. In 2017, we had Adele's 25 win over Beyoncé's Lemonade. In 2023, we had Harry's House win over Beyoncé's Renaissance. And in 2024, we had Taylor Swift's Midnights over SZA's SOS. So when I say this, I know that I need to say this. I'm not discrediting these wins. I feel like all of these wins are amazing albums. I'm not saying that Mumford & Sons' Babel did not deserve the win. What I'm saying is that when we look at this pattern of the fact that, especially in like the more prestigious categories of the Grammys, like Album of the Year, Song of the Year, Record of the Year, it's consistently white artists, especially when we have monumental albums being created like Beyoncé's Lemonade. Going back to this section of the article where it says like traditionally it's like being able to play an instrument and being able to sit and just show your skill seems to be a little bit more deemed more as talent than someone like Beyonce who can dance and who can work collaboratively, or any other artist that sort of works within a community rather than like a sole piece, like how Adele makes her albums. You know, it's usually just her singing. It's just crazy to me because when you think about like music history, really, I feel like there's two sides of music history. There's the Western art history, and then there's like sort of the history of every other cultural background that isn't white. And basically, like in the Western art world, you know, this is where we had the Mozarts and the Beethovens, and we had the classic and the Baroque era, and it was all about like prodigies. It was all about being able to play your instruments really well. But also, music was also a very classist thing. You had to be of the high society to understand it, to listen to it, and to learn about it. So a lot of the composers that came out of this time were white men because they were the only ones that could really excel in that area because they were of that class and they were of that race. And I think that that sort of trickled into like rock and roll, where, you know, sort of that like golden age of rock where it's like the 50s to like the 2000s. You know, if you were in a band and you played an instrument, you were a musician, you know, or if you could sing really well, you were deemed talented, and then that was that. And I feel like that's why pop and a lot of other genres that came later on, disco, funk, soul, music that was more around like dancing or working collaboratively, or, you know, it's sort of like what I was talking about before. Maybe the artist doesn't just play an instrument. Maybe they have really great performances. Maybe like they've got a foot in the fashion world. You know, they were deemed less talented because they didn't play a physical instrument. And I think that's why even today pop gets demonized a lot, because a lot of people will say, oh, but it's not real instruments, they're not playing real things. And I think that comes from like this sort of white side of music history. And then when you look at sort of like the cultural side of music history, and that's not just like African Americans, that's like every other culture that has used music. Like, you know, in Polynesian cultures, you know, music has been very, very much a tool in any culture. You know, it's about communicating ideas, it's about community, it's about inclusivity, which is crazy because white Western music history was always about exclusivity. It was always about, you aren't rich enough to listen to this music, you're not rich enough to learn about it, you're not rich enough to have the time to be able to participate in it. And I think that has really sort of leaked into today. And I feel like people might be thinking, well, no, like we're so far beyond that. I don't think so. I really don't. And then you've got like artists like Beyonce who have created monumental pop albums and songs and records, yet most of her wins, and I'm pretty sure she's the artist that has like some of the most wins ever. Most of these wins have come from these categories which are sort of related to her race. So like R&B and soul and, you know, hip hop. And I could just imagine how frustrating that would be, considering how much these cultures have contributed to music today and how much they've shaped how it's shaped the way that we perceive music and its performances. And I even think being able to play an instrument and like this whole thing that it's seen as something that's a little bit more better than, you know, if you're a singer or a dancer, you know, that in itself I think is still very classist today, because if you want to learn an instrument, first you need to have access to the lessons, you need to have access to the instruments, you need to have time and the space to be able to practice those instruments. And I think that is a little bit more renowned as talented, rather than if you, say, came from a lower income family and you couldn't afford those lessons, but you participated in your church and say, you know, you became a good singer just through singing in your church. That I think is seen as a little bit less renowned. It's just really interesting, and I feel like pigeonholing Black artists and artists of colour, especially within institutions like the Grammys, who are supposed to be like the pinnacle of the recording industry, I feel like it's just wrong the way that these artists aren't being properly recognized for their contributions and properly recognized as like people that are contributing to this industry. And it's not just, it's not just white artists. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. I really hope I brought all of that to light for you because, I think education and knowing about these things is the start of trying to change. Because I even know throughout my career and my music education, I came from a very whitewashed perspective of music where, as I said before, Elvis Presley was the person who created rock and roll. And, if you're in a white band with white men, like that's the pinnacle of musicianship, and then when you start to learn a lot more about like cultures and like the origins of jazz and funk and disco and soul and hip hop and how these genres are a lot more that they've come from like cultural events and they've literally been the vessel through trauma and the vessel through, hard times. And that's what people did. They created music to sort of help them through, and they created these styles that helped them to identify themselves and express themselves and create communities, and how that still is all just not being recognized at all. I think I'm going to have to leave that there, guys. But thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learnt a lot. And yeah, let me know what you think about Igor by Tyler, the Creator. Make sure to follow Zigentala, Zigentala, on all social media platforms. That's YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Make sure to follow me. Make sure to give my podcast a rating, please. It would mean the world to me. Every rating counts. And yeah, I wish you guys a good rest of the day, good rest of the night, wherever you are in the world. Take care, guys. Make sure to listen to good music. And I will see you in the next podcast episode. Ciao.